micro and macro elements that we as leaders of volunteers are navigating. And I'm going to pepper that in with some real life, real world examples. And I'm also going to explain, what are we talking about when we're talking about micro, we're talking about macro. And then we're going to examine how integrating these is really important. It can be really transformational for our work. And then connecting those things to be more strategic. So that strategic lens that Court talked about, because really that's going to allow us to create more meaningful volunteer experiences. It's going to allow us to obviously do what is the goal, the purpose of our work, which is to support increased impact for our communities and deliver on our mission. So just a little, FYI, stay to the end because I am going to introduce three key lenses. And what I will say is that this webinar is going to, the format of the webinar is we're going to talk about micro and macro, but we are also going to do a little amuse-bouche for those of you that, like little taster menus. This webinar is going to introduce three concepts or three lenses that we're going to be bringing to you as three individual webinars in 2026. So it's just a little taster platter. So you'll see we've got the Menti code at the top, and there is a QR code there for you. We would love to have you join us because we are going to dive in just a few minutes. So I'll just pause here for a second. I know the code and everything is going to be put in the chat as well. So we'll just give you a second to join. There we go. I see 74. I think we're getting there.
Yeah, it looks like we have about 50% of folks on the Zoom right now have so far been able to log on. Menti.
Okay, that number is jumping quickly. So, okay, I'm going to move on because the link and the code are in the chat. If you miss the QR code, we in volunteer engagement, we love to use terms without actually confirming that the term, we're all in agreement of what it means. I'll give you an example. Court mentioned that my master's thesis was quantifying the concept of volunteer engagement. And just as a little secret, I thought, this is going to be like a slam dunk. This is going to be so easy because we've been talking about volunteer engagement at that point, which is 15 years ago, for at least 15, 20 years. And then when I started digging into the research, I realized we had actually appropriated this term from HR, from employee engagement, without actually defining what it means and if it meant something different for volunteers. And spoiler alert, it does. So when we're talking about micro are specific individual things or tasks. Whereas when we're talking about macro, what I'm referring to are those broader systems, structures, and trends. So an example, micro would be if you need to recruit for a volunteer opportunity, your micro would be the specific tactics that you choose to use, right? So are you going to post at your local volunteer center? Are you going to send out something to a volunteer list that you have? Do you have social media channels for your organization? Macro are, as I said, the broader system structures and trends that often exist outside. They can exist within your organization, but they often exist outside. So for example, in your community, maybe you've got, a corporate partnership. Well, maybe in your community, that organization, that corporation has just done a bunch of layoffs, right? How is that going to impact the recruitment that you're doing? It could benefit it. It could actually impair it, right? So this is what I'm talking about when we're connecting micro and macro. And I'll just pause here, see if there's any questions about that in the chat. So Court and Annalise, just feel free to ping me if there are. So as Court mentioned, don't let the good youthful looks, fool you. I've been almost doing this for 30 years, volunteer engagement. And, we've had a lot of consistent challenges over the years, a lot of consistent complaints. And again, it doesn't matter if you're, what subsector you're in, if you're in arts, sports and recreation, in healthcare or, health management, social services. A lot of these things, there's some truisms, right? And the older I get and the more I, reflect on the nature of these things, what I've really come to realize is that these are symptomatic. These are symptoms of a micro and macro tension. And because so much of what we do is framed in the minds of others, in how they see our work, in how they frame our work, in how they understand our work, often in a limited fashion. It's really framed from a micro lens, right? So we're seen, and the work that we do is seen as being more administrative, not strategic. We are seen as a nicety, not always as this intentional and, required responsibility to partner with the community. We often are seen as what we do being standing alone, as opposed to being absolutely tied and connected to what's going on in our organization, what's going on in our community, and what's going on in the world writ large. So I'd just love to hear from you in a second. I just want to add a few more pieces, but I want you to just start thinking about that micro macro tension, because for me, one of the things we need to understand in order to be strategic and have a strategic mindset is that volunteerism doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? What happens and what we are doing absolutely is influenced by and influences the macro level. So I'll give you a personal example. When you're able to make these connections, you can understand, frame, and respond to challenges and opportunities holistically. This holistic piece is so critical to the strategic mindset, because to me, it's really an unrecognized superpower of volunteer engagement, that we have that 360-degree view very often because volunteers are involved in so many areas of our organization. And so if you think about, on the third point on the screen about a rapidly changing landscape, our landscape is not rapidly changing. Our landscape is absolutely being reshaped and terraformed at a level that is unprecedented. We are not talking about, changes in one area. We are talking about massive changes, tectonic change. If anybody's a Buffy the Vampire Slayer fan, there was a line years ago in one of the episodes that was like, before I hung out with you, Buffy, like I didn't need to know the plural of apocalypse, right? Right now, our world is, there's not just one existential threat to our communities, to our way of life, to life on this planet. There are multiple existential threats. I mean, that's big stuff. And you might think, well, I'm just over here engaging volunteers. It's got nothing to do with me. But you're wrong. And you're missing an opportunity. You're also, I think, missing a responsibility, because what we do matters. To understand and connect those pieces, it really positions you as a key resource in your organization. Because what is so critical right now, what is the new gold, of the 21st century? It's data. Right? And why? Because with data, we can build insights. We can make better informed decisions. We can be more strategic and more successful. So I think that is really important. So I promised you an example. Well, for anybody who is an old Susan J. Ellis fan, Susan used to joke that, volunteer engagement professionals are the busybodies of the nonprofit world. And I actually think it's a badge we should wear with honor, right? Because it's a power for us. And so as an example, in my own organization, I have been pulled into so many different projects that have nothing to do with volunteer engagement per se. For example, things like our constituent codes in our database. They're not including me because one of the constituent codes might be volunteer. It's because of the work that I do, because of the lenses that I see in a holistic fashion, I can say to them, hey, like we're labeling people in this way, but that's not how volunteers and other constituents are actually understanding and relating to us as an organization. So I'm able to bring insights and input into things because my organization recognizes that I have this lens that very few other people in the organization have, and it is valuable. And you can have that lens too. So getting into the sharing, you do have, again, the code at the top of the screen for the Menti, but I would just love to hear your thoughts briefly on this micro macro tension. Like, are you feeling it? Does that framing of micro and macro resonate with you? Just share your thoughts and they're going to pop up on the screen. And while you're doing that, I'm going to just check out the chat because it has been hopping.
Lots of responses coming in here on Menti. Really interesting to see that. It seems pretty unifying that folks are feeling that tension maybe day to day right now.
Yeah, I think most of our volunteers focus on the micro expectations. So helping them see the macro picture would be a change for us and for them. But I mean, how powerful, right? So imagine you're working in an organization that focuses on like food insecurity. But how much more powerful and how much more transformative would it be if they can start connecting some of the causes of food insecurity to the work that they do, right? Like that is powerful in terms of engagement. I feel like we've been pretty protected. Yeah, we have, and sometimes it's our choice, right? Sometimes we're happy to exist at that micro level, and that's not a criticism, but I think it's a missed opportunity. Definitely, I find if volunteers feel disconnected from the organization and the work we do with the community, they tend not to volunteer as long. Yes. Although I will just share a fun little snippet from my master's thesis is that the one defining feature between employee engagement and volunteer engagement was around intention to quit. Called in employee engagement, it's called an inverse relationship. So the higher your engagement, the lower your intention to quit, right? Makes sense. Happy people don't want to quit their jobs. However, what I found with volunteers is that because volunteering is a discretionary behavior, and all of our responsibilities as being like parents and partners and, children and, friends and all of those things, that if something shifts, so let's say your child, needs to, gets onto a competitive sports team and now you're playing, taxi to them and that takes up all of your time, or you have an aging parent or parents that you are now having to give additional care to, right? These are things that are beyond your control, but that you can't really say no to. And so what might happen is you choose to stop volunteering. But what I would say is that doesn't mean, as you said, it doesn't mean that they're not connected to the work that your organization is doing. You can still keep them on newsletters. You can still send them an annual, kind of check-in and hey, here's what's been happening. They may continue to become informal volunteers for your organization as advocating for the good work that you do. So it's not a hard stop goodbye, right? Something I've heard from colleagues so often is yes, sometimes the micro, aka administrative, gets so intense that there doesn't feel like there is time for the macro, right? And I think that's part of the advocating that we need to do for ourselves. But also it's how we need to manage our time, right? Really great comments. So I think we got a little bit of, a sense of this, but would just love to hear from you. What do you tend towards, micro or macro? And then the next slide, we're just going to ask for a bit of why. Okay. So one of the ththings I thought I knew the answer to this, but I don't like to make assumptions because we are a very diverse group as professionals, right? We tend to, I think, erroneously presume that we're all the same, that we all have the same values. We all have the same, goals, right? And that's, just not true. So would love to just hear from you. What do you tend towards, micro or macro? And again, there's no judgment here. This is just part of leadership, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, is self-awareness, right? So it's important for us to just recognize and become self-aware. We're definitely seeing a trend towards more micro than macro, which is what I kind of guessed that we would see. So keep doing that, but start thinking about why do you think that is? And we'll move on to the next Menti slide in a second. But why do you think you tend towards that? And we kind of, we teased it out in one of the responses that I highlighted, but would just love to hear from a range of people about why do you think you tend towards the micro or the macro? Okay, Bella's saying more examples of the macro and micro. I promise we will get there, Bella. It is in the upcoming slides. More examples. Absolutely. We will get there. We're going to actually take each of the three lenses and actually start framing them out at a macro level and at a micro level. So I do promise we will get there. So interesting. Oh, I love this. Micro feels more like instant gratification. Yes. And you're right. Micro is more task oriented, right? It seems more immediate or pressing. There is the urgent and there is the important, right? And so if you're thinking about that, yeah, especially as you're developing a new volunteering involvement strategy, absolutely. Focus on the micro to create solid data that can serve as a foundation for my macro goals and ideas. I love that. Yes, you need to start from somewhere. So absolutely, that's a very smart strategy. Yes, small team. So it's hard to spend time on the macro when the micro is more urgent. 100%. Wonderful. These are such good answers. And I hope you are maybe inspired and feel a little validated if you are seeing one over the other, that you're not alone. And as I said, there's no right or wrong. We're all at different places. And even even if you've been around the block like I have in each new job. So you might start out more at the micro, and there's nothing wrong with that. So thank you for those answers. That's really great. So you wanted examples. So let's dive in. Okay. So as I said, these are little amuse-bouches of 3 concepts or 3 lenses, which will become individual webinars in 2026. And I'm going to frame out the lens, and then I'm going to explain to you how the micro and macro works for each of these, okay? So the first lens is global trends. We often don't see that so much of what we do is absolutely influenced and can influence, in turn, global trends. So, for example, right now, like a big social global trend is isolation. It's loneliness, it's disconnection, it's radicalization. Right? These are symptoms of isolation. And yet one of the best ways to combat that is volunteerism, right? And so there are absolutely correlations between strong volunteerism and not just, formal volunteerism, but in these cases, often informal volunteering, which is volunteering not through a formal organization, but the work that we do, just, what we would maybe call neighboring, right? I think that's the term that Brianna Dorless uses, is neighboring, which is just such a beautiful way of speaking to the connectedness of our community in an informal, structureless way, right? And so, volunteerism in all of its forms can absolutely change that, can address those concerns. Because what does volunteerism do? We know it builds connection. It adds value and purpose to people's lives. It breaks down silos because you are often interacting with people that you wouldn't normally meet, maybe in your neighborhood, right? So it is introducing you to people who are often maybe different from you on some levels, but perhaps what you share are values, right? So, and connectivity. And I'll do a shout out to Megan, who I believe is on today's webinar, who is the volunteer coordinator at National Service Dogs, where I'm volunteering to raise a service puppy. And that's a really good example of how, I'm meeting so many other amazing volunteers that I would never cross paths with in my life before. And we can be very, very different. We can look different. We can have different, native tongues. We can have different backgrounds, different socioeconomic circumstances, different cultural and religious backgrounds. But what we share is a love of dogs, right? So, volunteering can be such a powerful way to address those things. So let's do another micro macro. I promised you guys, I promised it. So here it is. So for this trend of like the global trends lens, let's look at the micro and the macro. The micro would be, let's say, volunteer recruitment. The macro would be, let's say, a global recession. Now, you might not think, you might say, well, how would a global recession impact my local volunteer recruitment? And the answer is, it absolutely will. If we have a global recession, the chances are that your country will be in recession because it's part of the globe. But it is really interesting that it may have either a positive impact or a negative impact. So we're not defining the nature of the impact, just that there is, right? So for example, because I'm old, and I can tell you I've lived through a few recessions, both national and global, in the past, what you would often see is that when there was a national or global recession, you might actually see an influx of people wanting to volunteer. Why? Well, because when you're unemployed, you may be looking to keep busy. You may be looking to stay, engaged in your community, to build new connections, possibly gain references, to utilize the skills that you have to keep them fresh, or to even learn new skills, to maybe say, I've lost my job or been laid off, maybe I need to pursue another career. How many of us have volunteers who come to our organizations because they're looking for a potentially career change? That's very, very common, right? It's one of the top reasons why people volunteer, is to gain or learn new skills. So in the past, we often saw a positive impact from a global recession on our volunteer recruitment. Not always and not equitably, right? So, taking that into account. But what we're starting to see now with global recessions is that actually, because of the compounding nature of all of those bubbles that you saw, the political, the economic, the social, all of that, I'm anticipating that when we see global recessions in the future, we won't actually see bumps in volunteer recruitment because people are already working so many secondary jobs, side hustles. People are working longer, even beyond retirement because of past financial, like the 2018 financial disaster. So many people pushed back their retirement plans because they'd lost so much money in their investments in the market. More and more grandparents are helping to raise and provide free childcare for younger, like for their children and grandchildren, because of the cost of, and the availability. So there's all these really interesting tensions, right? And so it's really important that you have some understanding of what's going on and how it might impact. You don't have to have all the answers. Nobody's got a crystal ball, right? But it is important for you from a strategic mindset to start understanding how these things might fit together. Okay. And I'll maybe just pause here just to check in the chat.
Not as much questions. Definitely seeing that time is a challenge when it comes to volunteer recruitment. And it does sound like a lot of things might be work related with people coming out of retirement and going back to work. Maybe similar things to what you were speaking to about, grandparents needing to help take care of grandkids and some other trends that might be affecting people's ability to have time for volunteerism and definitely for volunteerism that's happening during specific times of the day.
Yeah, great. Super. Depending on the nature of your organization, depending on where you're located, some of these things may have a larger or more muted impact, right? But they absolutely are going to have an impact. So the second kind of lens that I want to introduce you to is transformational leadership. And we very rarely call ourselves leaders in a more informal sense. We call ourselves leaders of volunteer engagement often, but we don't see ourselves in a position of leadership. And the thing is that leadership can be formal, right? Because maybe you're the executive director or CEO. That's a formal leadership role. But volunteer leadership is absolutely a leadership role, whether you're on the senior leadership team or management team of your organization or not, is absolutely a leadership role. And we have an opportunity, when we're looking at leadership then, to think about the style, or not. Leadership style is different than a leadership kind of theory, right? So you can have the great man theory of leadership, which it's bunk, but this is really about a style. So this is exactly who we are and what we are trying to do. And the reason being is that transformational leadership, it's pretty self-explanatory. We transform, but we not only transform people, we transform organizations. And beyond that, I would argue that we transform communities. And by transforming communities, we transform regions, states, provinces, countries, and the world, right? To me, that's pretty darn inspiring, and I think when we look at it through, look at our work through the lens of transformational leadership, knowing that we are affecting change, it makes it much easier for us to connect the micro to the macro, right? Because we are seeing things, not just an individual person who's volunteering and how maybe they're growing and learning and evolving as a human being by being engaged with us, but also the impact on all the, the people in the community. We can also look at it at a kind of mini macro level, right? Which is, by the work that we do, we are transforming our organizational culture, our local community, right? But yeah, so you can really transform so many things at multiple levels. So let me just share some examples. There we go. The slide is just pulling up. There we go. So at a kind of more tangible level, we can connect the volunteer experience to our organizational culture and mission delivery, right? So that's the micro to the macro. It's not a global macro, but it's still a macro, right? Because it's our whole organization. So a really good example of this is, we recruit people, but our goal is to help create these experiences. And yet, if the organizational culture is such that it doesn't understand that volunteer engagement is an outcome, which is the responsibility of the entire organization, right? Think of volunteer engagement as, as a credit card or a debit card, right? Like, you can't be responsible because either they're being great staff partners to volunteers or really being terrible staff partners to volunteers. So, one example is many years ago, I was working in an organization and we had just a continual turnover of volunteers with a certain staff partner because they weren't committed to being a good staff partner. They said, well, you're the volunteer manager, Erin, so this is your responsibility. But I'm like, you're the one that actually partners day to day with these volunteers. So I'm part of this, but really you need to take some responsibility here. And it got to the point where I actually refused to recruit for this person, for roles with this person, because I said to my boss, this is a reputational liability issue now. We are now getting to the point where so many people have had a bad experience and have left volunteering with us. They haven't even wanted to move to another opportunity, that it is going to become harder not only to recruit for this role, but for the entire organization, right? So you can see how one little thing over here can absolutely impact the whole organization. So I'll just pause there and see if anything's popped up, Court, in the chat.
Yeah, it definitely seems like the example that you gave just now from your experience is something that many other folks have experienced as well, and having the whole organization being a good steward of the volunteer experience.
Yeah.
And understanding that the volunteer experience is a part of organizational culture and not just in like, oh, Erin, that's you. You're responsible. I'm not responsible. But if that person is, the team leader of a program, it's very much affecting those details that affect the big picture.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, and so I saw there was a couple comments in the chat there about, yes, I recognize this is a problem for me too. How do we address it? What I would say is I've always started from data because I'm a geek and I love data. So which is a perfect segue to the next lens, but I'll talk a little bit more about that, okay? Because it's a perennial issue. So the third lens that I think is so important to have in order to build that strategic mindset is around metrics. And for me, it's specifically metrics that matter. Right? Because in all my years of doing this work, I can tell you, I might actually put it on my tombstone, that we track far too much and it tells us far too little. And it tells us far too little, not because we don't have this glut of data and metrics, but it is not actually metrics. The point of metrics is to gain insights. And so if you cannot if the data that you're collecting, if the metrics that you're collecting aren't helping you make informed strategic decisions, then you may want to look at why you're collecting it. Now, I get it. And I pinky promise to all of you, I will not go off on a rant about volunteer hours. If you ever want to lose 2 hours of your life, call me up, buy me a coffee, and I will talk your ear off about volunteer hours and why they're not a metric that matters. But I get it. Sometimes we're mandated, right? What I've created is a quadrant metrics model, and think of like a 2x2 square, right? So 2 squares, 2 squares. And on one level is internal performance and external performance. And at the other level is internal outcome and mission impact and external outcome and mission impact. So what do I mean by performance? Performance are the things like, how many applications you receive, how much time does it take you, to go through these, to have interviews, how many interviews are you having, how long is the intake process, right? So, from beginning to end, how long does it take to bring on a volunteer? Because that is investment, right? And we're going to talk about that in a second, that's an investment that your organization is making in volunteer involvement, right? Performance is also like the things that tell us, are we doing better? So for example, if we, again, just to use recruitment because it's such a common activity that so many of us do, you might say, okay, great. Well, if I have 3 places that I post my opportunities, 50 applications from posting on this site, but you know what? So many of them ghosted me. We got maybe one person to actually follow through and go through the process. So you know what? Even though this is, it sounds like it's a good site to post on because we got 50 applications, it actually didn't result in more people joining us as volunteers. And it took a ton of time and resources for me. So you know what? That's maybe not a tactic that I'm going to use for this particular role. Maybe it's a maybe it's a great strategy for some other roles. And so again, this is where you're able to start parsing out and being able to articulate how much work that you are doing, and even being able to say to your boss, like, hey, I've had requests for 300 volunteer roles to fill this year, and I have filled 75% of them. That's a pretty powerful statement, right? So these are the kinds of things that we can articulate that do matter, so that when your coworker comes to you and says, oh, by the way, Erin, we need 20 volunteers tomorrow, I can say, well, go to your magic drawer and pull them out, because I'm not a magician, right? So, it takes 6 weeks to pull somebody into this, right? So much of what we do and the work that we do, liken it to a duck swimming along the water, and it looks so calm, and people think, oh, what a lovely job. You get to work with people. What they don't see is how madly we are paddling under the water. So it's kind of like in high school in math, right? We have to show our work. We have to help demystify what it takes to be successful in our organization. Okay. The outcome and mission impact, some examples of metrics that would be things like referral, right? Word of mouth is still the number one source of volunteers, and often the strongest source of people who are actually going to follow through and become volunteers with us. So, what percentage of word of mouth is there, or like peer referral is there? How much of the revenue that your organization raises are volunteer driven? I was able to double a department that I led in volunteer engagement because I was able to articulate that our major fundraising event was 100% volunteer led, and therefore this many millions of dollars comes by engaging volunteers. And when they invested in my team, we not only got more volunteers, we got volunteers who were a better fit because we had done the work to screen and orient and support those volunteers, as well as to orient and support and train those staff that are the staff partners of those volunteers. So revenue that were attributed, not entirely, but partially and in good part, to the work that we were doing in volunteer engagement, right? Same with mission programs. If you have a program that is very dependent on volunteer delivery, whether it's, like a volunteer driver program, or in a food bank, or even an arts and sports program, right? A lot of the time, those are entirely volunteer driven. If you can say we are able to actually deliver on our full programming because of the work we're doing in volunteer engagement, and successfully screen and bring on board people, that can be a very powerful statement. So let's just go to the micro and macro. When you are able to identify performance and KPIs that are at the micro level, but that really speak to how valuable the investment that an organization is making into you and into volunteers, it can be really transformational. So, there may be KPIs and metrics that you are forced to track, right? That doesn't stop you from collecting others to articulate the value of that investment. And that's, for me, why I don't talk about volunteerism as a program, because it's not a cost center. It is a strategic decision that your organization is making to involve volunteers, because it is a more successful way to deliver and achieve your mission. Fundraising. Nobody has a fundraising program, really. Fundraising is also a strategy that organizations can choose to use to resource their organization and their programs and services, right? So, framing it in this way can be really transformational. All right, Court?
Yeah, it looks like we have some really interesting thoughts coming up about, hours being required, but then also other more meaningful metrics. So really appreciate your insights on sharing that, sometimes you can do the things that you have to, but then there are also other things that you can collect that would be really important for telling that more robust story. Additionally, it seems like there's also a lot of really interesting conversation in the chat about requests for volunteers happening like spur of the moment.
Yeah.
And that maybe it's easy to just like snag, 20 to 100 volunteers, really quickly. And so that's really interesting, because it feels like maybe that perception of volunteers being easy to just grab at any moment for other departments or other needs without enough time or engagement or strategic planning. Like it seems like that is maybe tied into this
Absolutely,
understanding.
100%, right? And that is why that micro macro tension, right? Because people are thinking when we get these types of requests, it's not personal, right? It's because they see what we do as micro in this is, in this very kind of more simplistic terms. But, my friend Lynn Felker always says volunteers are not chairs. Pull them out when we need a few extra chairs around the table. These are people that have lives, that have schedules, and so it is disrespectful to this resource, right? Just like, let's think about this. If suddenly you had a shortfall in your, in your fundraising campaign, like, sure, you can go out and ask donors to, hey, like, we're $1,000 short, like help us build that. But you're not going to expect them to donate literally within 24 hours to do that, right? Like, again, it's being respectful of and understanding the dynamics. It's really important that we're taking that into account. And those are the kinds of things that we can pull out with metrics, right? Because we can say, we can do profiles of volunteers to our coworkers to say, like, these are the types of people that we have engaged with us in our organization. Like, look at the diversity, but also, like, if I called you tomorrow, would you be available? Right? Like, this isn't a volunteer problem. This is just a respect and a people problem. So I think it's really important when, that we connect the micro and the macro, because it really does position us in a strategic mindset and a resource of information and insights, as well as people power, right? Getting to that question, like, we can certainly put out an emergency call potentially to volunteers, but how respectful are we being of them donating their only non-renewable resource, which is time, as well as, many other things, to just, like, so what? So they just shouldn't feed their family, make family dinner for their family, or, pick up their kids from school because you didn't plan? It's disrespectful to us. It's disrespectful to them. And a lot of that, again, it just comes from education, right? And so that's why Metrics That Matter can be so powerful, as well as the transformational leadership and the trends, is really understanding, connecting the micro and macro really does speak to strategic investment. That if you want volunteer engagement to be successful in your organization, then there needs to be investment, because while we may not be paying volunteers per se, there is a cost, hard and soft cost. And I also think by connecting these two kind of, spectrum ends, that we really are able to position volunteer engagement as a driver of mission and organizational success. So I think it is really critical. What happens is, again, volunteers continue, and our work continues to be seen as a nicety and not as actually a strategic goal of the organization. So what? So at the end of all of this, the value and benefits of a strategic mindset are really being able to not fight for resources all the time. And I know that this is a common issue. It's being included and consulted in critical conversations and planning, and it's articulating the impact and understanding of the skill required by us to deliver that impact. The takeaway, I'd really encourage you to reflect and evaluate what macro trends may be impacting your volunteer engagement in your organization, and really thinking about how you might be able to reframe things through a strategic mindset, either using the global trends, the transformational leadership, or the Metrics That Matter lenses, how you might position yourself and your work, and more. So I will just move to that slide, and I'll just also check the chat. But Court, any other questions that you've seen pop up?
Yeah, we've had a lot of really great commentary about folks like sharing some of the things that they do at their organization that I think has been really helpful for everybody, checking out some of the ways in which different organizations appreciate volunteers or manage the volunteer experience, or even processes for other departments at the organization requesting volunteers.
Yeah.
Seems to be really, really incredible. So I'm just going to check and see, are there any specific questions that you'd like to pose to Erin? We've got a couple of minutes.
But yeah.
I think one of the things that I saw as a trend, that some organizations, it seemed like volunteer leaders were sharing that some organizations are really big picture. And that was really interesting to me, to where they were like, we're more challenged with the micro and like the things like the volunteer appreciation and like the volunteer communications. And so it feels like what I'm noticing is that tension of it can be really challenging to find a balanced place here.
Yeah. So, okay. So how do you use these micro macros to make you feel appreciated? So here's, I love volunteer appreciation from a micro macro thing because I think it's far more complex than we acknowledge, but also I actually think it's somewhat less important, right? Like we talk so much about volunteer recognition and appreciation. The thing is that recognition, so first of all, recognition and appreciation, two different things. Recognition is, Court, you've done a great job of flagging questions and answering things in the chat, versus appreciation, which is, Court, you have been so supportive and communicative as we've prepped for this, for this session. This is me personally recognizing Court's qualities, right? So one thing is that we tend to focus so much on the tactical recognition. So it's the service pins, it's the certificates, it's things like that. But what research shows is that recognition, it's much more personal in terms of not only that many volunteers actually don't like public recognition. So they don't like, being profiled on social media. They don't like, the things in the newspapers or, things on the website. What they really appreciate is actually a personalized thank you that acknowledges their particular contributions to the work and to the mission. Right. So, it's actually much simpler. Like, I think we make this much more labored than it needs to be. And as a result, we actually don't see, the outcomes that we want. So again, I would go back to my research around volunteer engagement is that even when people are engaged, they may still quit. So I also don't want you to think that if you don't recognize somebody correctly, that they're going to quit. I mean, people may feel unappreciated, but I would say, when you are able to communicate the impact of their work and add in that personal appreciation aspect to it, that is the magic formula. So being able to say, Court, thank you for the hours that you've spent in preparing for this webinar. We were able to have such an amazing conversation, and you facilitated that in such a beautifully inclusive way, is a very meaningful way to recognize people. And I don't think there's very many people who would not want that. That doesn't mean that they may not also want other things, but I think we spend too much time. Again, this is one where I think we actually, as a profession, spend way too much time and energy on this micro piece and don't think about the fact that, what's really great volunteer recognition is training people. What's really great volunteer recognition is actually talking to them about the impact of their work and directly showing it, right? So, you can get into McClelland's affiliation, appreciation, and those are all good things. I'm not taking away from that, but I don't want you to focus so much or get so concerned about that, because that is a nuance. It's just like Myers-Briggs, right? It's a style. It can be helpful, but I don't want you to kind of, just focus so much on the micro that you miss the macro, right? So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, Erin, and I have a couple more questions following up, some about metrics. So I want to put a pin in that and definitely get your insight on that before we log off, even though I know we're 1 minute over time right now. I do want to say that something that you said just now and earlier, I thought was really insightful, because it actually feels like maybe spending time on cross-department staff training about volunteer stewardship is a form of volunteer recognition.
100%.
Right. Because then you've got everybody at the organization engaged in noticing volunteers and the volunteer experience. And it's not reliant on you having a recognition event or, being able to touch base with everyone individually, because that is like too heavy of a burden to carry if you have a large number of volunteers or volunteers in dispersed locations, and it would be impossible to do, but there's a way of recognizing by doing that staff training. So it might not be direct, but it could be indirect volunteer recognition.
100%, because volunteer engagement, as I said, it's an outcome. And so it is a collective responsibility to partner effectively with volunteers. And this is what I was talking about with the kind of debit credit card example, is like so much of the the cost, the payment is put on our shoulders. And yet it's not necessarily us, maybe. Again, your organization may be different. But for example, in my organization, I do no screening, I interact very little with volunteers. All of my work is actually supporting staff to work effectively with volunteers. That's just how my organization is structured, right? Yours could be different, but that is a very strategic decision to make, because I can't have those personal interactions with every volunteer. It's like you said, Cord, it's impossible. So by empowering people, so for example, during National Volunteer Week and other things, I give templated things to staff to say, here's a basic template, and here's where you're going to insert, the department or team or role with a volunteer. And here's where you're going to insert some very specific individual things about that particular volunteer that you want to shout out, right? So again, I'm trying to support them. It's not perfect, right? Nothing we do ever is, nothing in the world ever is, but we're trying to empower them, to not only take responsibility, but also to support them in doing it effectively. So I hope that's helpful.
I think that's a great idea. I love the template idea of just that's a mini training, and it's a tool that someone on the staff at the organization can take and go, oh, okay, right away, especially if they're busy walking down the hall and they're at a loss, they've got the card. It's like a mini training tool. Yeah. The last question I'll ask before we log off today is just, do you have any examples of maybe 3 to 5 metrics that would be outside of hours that, would be an interesting thing for people to maybe start collecting as far as data? It could be helpful in telling a more robust picture. What would be some examples of those types of metrics outside of hours tracking?
Yeah, pardon me. I think we'll just check those other ones. I would say off the top of my head, one thing would be the number of requests that you get, right? Because so often we are a department of one, we're solo, departments. And so people, because we're supporting often the entire organization, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing, right? We're getting an urgent request from this department. They don't know that we just got a request for 150 volunteers for tomorrow from this department, right? So part of that is, again, it's what we call line of sight in leadership, right? It's helping people to understand what else is on our plate and the connectivity of what we're doing to other things. So I would say being able to track the volume of requests that you're getting. And, if you want to get into the nature, is this an episodic opportunity? Is this an ongoing opportunity? I would also say how much time it takes you if you have more ongoing opportunities where you're interviewing, screening, orienting, training, placing volunteers, those journeys. I would say being able to quantify how much time it takes you to do those things, and also where in the process maybe people drop off would be very helpful for you to know, because maybe that means that, our processes, maybe we can tighten it up, make it, faster, easier, things like that, again, because, and this is why performance is one of those quadrants, internal and external performance, because it helps you redesign the volunteer experience based on what you're seeing, right? So if everybody we get lots of, applications, and people are happy to initially talk to us, but then when we talk to them about, okay, well, this is what's required, and they drop off, again, you can start diving in to say, well, why might that be, and asking people for feedback. I mean, if people ghost you, I mean, that's the other thing, right? Is things have changed, people ghost. So I also wouldn't take it too personally. So I would look at a whole journey, because you might notice trends where, we have a huge drop off generally for all of our role postings, lots of expressions of interest or applications, and then people ghost us. And then you can start piecing out, well, are people ghosting from every site we're posting on? Are people ghosting at the same level for every opportunity, right? Things like that. So it allows you, those are, I would say, more macro things within your purview of performance that will allow you to really articulate the volume of work that you do, the investment of work that you're doing to get people into a placed volunteer or active volunteer position. And also it allows you to start getting some insights into, do I need to tweak how we do this to make it a better experience for volunteers and maybe more streamlined, so we can get more people into, supporting our mission.
Erin, thank you so much for your time. And I just want to say thank you for sharing the strategic mindset today. Thank you for the thoughtfulness that you placed on the examples given through these 3 lenses. And I just really want to say thank you for your attentiveness as well to, the questions and the experiences posed by the volunteer engagement professionals present today. I know we have a ton of diversity as far as the organizations, geographical locations, the different things that folks are facing in their communities. And so really, really want to say thank you so much. Erin, any final words? Thanks for the extra time that you spent with everyone.
No, my pleasure. I please do connect with me. Would love to continue the conversation, and make sure when you hear about the webinars that come out in 2026 that you join us again and hear even more.
Yeah, we're going to dive into each of these topics in greater depth, because honestly, we could have spent hours just talking about metrics alone. So I know that that's your specialty. And I just am really grateful for the conversation. Thanks for everyone hanging with us and spending your hour here today. And again, we will be sending you some follow-up, and please look for that in your inbox. And we'll see you again at next month's Get Connected: Innovative Approaches to Volunteer Leadership webinar series. Thanks, Erin Spink. And thank you to everyone. And thanks to my teammate Annalise as well. Y'all take care, and we'll see you real soon.